All right, everybody. Well, we are going to go ahead and get started. Welcome to our Science for Success Soybeans Down the Stretch webinar. We're excited to have you here. Science for Success is a group of researchers and extension specialists at land grant institutions across the United States who deliver best management practices to U.S. soybean farmers. My name is Rachel Van. I'm a faculty member at the University of Illinois Urbana-Champaign, and I'm excited to facilitate this Science for Success webinar today. Because this is a national initiative, we've got soybeans coming down the stretch in parts of the country, and we're excited to dive into some of those late season management topics like desiccation, green stem, seed moisture that inevitably pop up as soybeans move into those later growth stages. Before we get into the content of this webinar, just wanted to share a couple logistics things. We will use the chat to share research-based resources and contact information for the various panelists today. If you have any technical difficulties, you can use the chat to get up with us, and we'll try to get those addressed. When we move into the Q&A part of the panel, after we have a few brief presentations, please use the Q&A function in Zoom to submit your questions. We also have reviewed many of the previously submitted questions as well. We will also be polling throughout the webinar, so polls will pop up. Please participate in those as you can. It'll give us important information to help drive our initiative forward, and we'll just have a little bit of fun with the poll. So here's our first poll question popping up right here. So please participate if you can. And we have a panelist here of folks from across the United States with expertise in some of these late season management challenges. I will introduce each of these individuals as we get to their presentation part of this webinar. So the first half of this webinar will be some presentations to get your wheels spinning on some of these late season management challenges, and we'll leave plenty of time for questions at the end of this webinar. So to kick us off, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Justin Calhoun. He is the state soybean specialist at Mississippi State University and a member of our Science for Success group. Justin has a lot of experience with soybean desiccation, being located in the Mid-South. And so, Justin, take it away.
Yeah, thank you for that, Rachel, and good afternoon, everybody. Excited to share with you guys this afternoon on a panel that's pretty unique because we get to have perspectives from all over the country. And so very excited to be able to share with you about late season soybean management just from a Mid-Southerner's perspective. So really what I want to do this afternoon is share with you 4 key points that I think are important when it comes to managing soybeans late season. Much of our conversation this afternoon is going to revolve around harvest aids and desiccants, but I would be remiss to not talk about things that lead up to that, especially for us in the Mid-South. The number one question I get this time of year is growth stage questions. Are these beans at R6.5 or R7? And the first key management point is just to know those growth stages and know them well. It's really critically important to be able to identify these growth stages for us in the Mid-South. We consider things like insect thresholds, irrigation thresholds, and moisture termination, and then talk about the timing of harvest aids and desiccants. Knowing these growth stages are critically important. We have a really good growth stage guide at Mississippi State University. I'm a little bit biased, but I do think it may be the best in the country in terms of pictures and detailed descriptions of what those growth stages look like. And so I can't stress this enough. Probably the most important management practice for late season soybean management is just knowing those late season growth stages. The second key management point for me is understanding that when we talk about late season soybean management, whether it be insects, irrigation, or getting into applying harvest aids, it's all about protecting your yield, not adding to it. And I think this sometimes can be a pretty common misconception. I get a lot of growers that ask me sometimes about some of these late season inputs, especially folks that are trying to cut back on input costs as we're rounding out the year, about how many bushels is this really adding to my bottom line when it comes to to those late season management inputs. And that misconception kind of lives there. We're not really adding bushels to our bottom line. We're protecting the yield that we've already invested in with early season inputs. So it's all about making sure that we maximize that ROI on the money that we've already spent earlier in the year. The third key management point for me when I think about late season maturity or management, and this is getting on into the discussion of harvest aids, is just using them as a management tool. Now I'll go ahead and throw a disclosure out here. Myself and the other panelists, we're gonna talk a lot about desiccation, and we're not talking about any one particular product. For us in the Mid South, we most commonly use paraquat. But because of regulatory issues surrounding paraquat and availability questions, we kind of just really want to spend our time talking in general about some of these products. So we're talking about a spectrum of products that we can use there. And especially for us in the Mid South, I think there's a little bit of another misconception, especially since we're used to cotton management, that these harvest aids are a maturity tool. With a lot of our hormonal type products that we use in cotton that can speed up that maturity process, we bring the same kind of mindset sometimes to our soybean management system, and that's simply not the case. When we apply a harvest aid, that is just managing that foliage that remains on the plant, and it does not speed up the maturity process. In fact, we're terminating that crop at the current maturity stage. And so we have that kind of misconception, and I think sometimes that has led to some early applications that are just mistimely and can eat into our bottom line and again, eat away at that yield that we spent the entire season trying to build up to. And then my fourth and final key management point that I always talk about when it comes to harvest aids is that the value of those harvest aids really depends on the environmental challenge. For us here in the Mid South, I included that picture there on the bottom. You can see those were some R6 soybeans that I took pictures of just last week in Mississippi. I've talked with other specialists, some on the panel here, about what R6 soybeans look like across the country. And I know for some folks in more northern states, by the time you get to some of these later stages, that crop begins to senesce on its own. Especially on early planted beans, we don't typically see that. We'll maintain a lot of greenness on into the harvest season. And you can see there in the background of that picture, I still have a lot of green leaves on that plant. And so some of these early season, early planting dates, as we manage them throughout the season, are more prime candidates for harvest aid applications as we try to manage that foliage. There on the bottom right picture, we have some quality issues that we've seen in the Mid South. We deal with hurricanes and tropical storms that roll through during our harvest season, and so those harvest aids really increase in their value when we have some of those on the horizon that can potentially harm soybean quality if we don't get out there and manage them efficiently. So those are my four key points when it comes to late season soybean management, and I'll turn it over to the next speaker in hopes that this kind of builds us up to that conversation.
Thank you, Justin. We surely appreciate your perspective on this panel, having a lot of boots on the ground experience with some of those late season challenges. And now we're going to bounce from Mississippi up to Michigan and introduce Dr. Christy Sprague. She's an extension weed specialist and professor at Michigan State University, a member of the Take Action and Grow collaborative weed science groups. And we're excited to hear your perspectives on desiccation today, Christy.
Thanks, Rachel. And it was great to hear from Justin about some of the stuff that they've been dealing with down south. So in the north, typically we don't usually look at desiccation of soybeans that often. So it's kind of a newer thing that people are really exploring. And part of it is we're trying to start to plant soybeans earlier and trying to maybe use some later maturity soybeans. And from that standpoint, we're trying to make sure we can get harvest done a little bit earlier, particularly for the guys that are wanting to plant winter wheat. So that's one of the kind of the main thrusts behind this. Another thing, so in Michigan, we grow a lot of dry beans. So I've been working with desiccants for a really long time because that is a pretty standard practice in dry beans. And then one of the other things is really from the standpoint of how do we desiccate weeds. So what I thought I would do is talk a little bit about some of the stuff that we've been doing over the last couple of years, looking at from the standpoint of soybean desiccation in the north. So, as Justin said, there's a number of products. We've looked at a fair number of them. From the last few years, we've kind of compared them, and paraquat or gramoxone and defol, which is sodium chlorate. Those two are pretty equivalent when it comes to actually the effectiveness of that. And you can see that there on the slide there as far as looking at those two products compared to the non-desiccated soybeans. And usually we see about 20% greater desiccation, or just basically helping move along that leaf drop. If you look at any of these labels, there's pretty specific instructions on what is a label application of some of these desiccation products. And most of them say we need to have about 65% of the pods mature, or look at 70% leaf drop, or they're always talking about 30% or less moisture. So as we look at some of those labels, they kind of restrict us from some of maybe the earlier applications. So when we looked at that, there's not much advantage to increasing that, at least from our stuff up in Michigan. When we looked at some of our harvest days, we compared those earlier applications to kind of what the label applications are. And we did see at that R65, we did see some yield reductions from 7 to 9% in 50% of those years. So out of 2 out of 4 of those site years. Additionally, one other thing that we did is we decided to look at what happened to the kind of the soybean seed dry down. Are we able to, increase the speed of that soybean or decrease moisture? And out of all 4 of the site years that we had, we only saw 1 year, and really we only saw a 2-day advantage to using one of those desiccation products to really reducing that seed moisture. So probably not really helping us out a whole lot as far as that seed maturity, very similar to what Justin said. So as we looked at a lot of our stuff that we've done, really from our northern perspective up in Michigan, really didn't see too much of an advantage to using a harvest aid to really speed down dry down, but it does help desiccate some of those leaves that are out there. But one of the benefits that we primarily see is if we're trying to improve our harvest efficiency, if there's weedy fields out there. And we've got a lot of challenges with herbicide resistant weeds, also weeds that we're not getting very good control of. So in those situations when we need to get out there and those weeds are green, a lot of times some of these harvest aids can help reduce the challenges that we have with those weeds when we're trying to start harvest.
Thank you, Christy, for some of those perspectives from Michigan. We've heard from Mississippi, we've heard from Michigan, and now we're going to introduce Mark Kindle, who is a graduate student with Sean Conley at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, to discuss his work on desiccation from a more national lens. And one of the things that we're really passionate about in Science for Success is making sure we train the next generation of researchers and extension folks to work in soybeans and beyond. So really thrilled to have you here to discuss this, Mark.
All right. Thanks for having me, Rachel. Thank you to everyone participating, for taking time out of your busy schedules to join us. So we want to talk a little bit from, like Rachel said, that larger scale research study that we did on soybean desiccation. It occurred back in 2024. You can see across large sections of the major soybean growing portions of the country. We had 13 states participate, 19 different fields. And because of all the varying management practices, planting dates, maturity groups that our farmers that we work with utilize, we wanted to look at multiple planting dates. We want to look at, the people planting early versus soybeans that get planted late. I mean, up here in the north, as soon as the snow is off the ground, or maybe even the same day, we're in the field. And then it starts snowing in the fall, we're still combining beans, it seems like. Maturity group, we wanted to look at what was typical for that site. We also wanted to look at early and later maturity group soybeans, depending on the goals that a farm would have. And then we also wanted to look, of course, at the multiple desiccation timing. So we had our control treatment, desiccation R6.5 and R7. We used sodium chlorate, D-Fol 5, 4.8 quarts per acre, and we sprayed 20 gallons per acre of water through ground application, the ground sprayers, and we included a pint per acre of methylated seed oil as the label told us to recommended to include as well. And then we wanted to look at, as has been discussed plenty so far, some of the major things that we want to collect, looking at yield, seed quality, green stem, and harvest timing as well. The picture you see, you can get a nice mosaic in the field there at the bottom. And then just to build off of what Justin said earlier about the timing of our growth stages, if you're interested in our growth guide from Wisconsin, the QR code's in the upper right-hand corner. R7 is pretty straightforward, where we start to see mature pods develop on the plants in the majority of the field. R6.5 can be subjective. R6 is when we get that fully swelled up beans within the pods, and then midway through, usually they start to shrink down. They're starting to lose moisture and starting to detach from that white membrane. You can see at the top there. So those were the two timings that we were targeting that a lot of growers who are using desiccants try to target as well. And just to move through quickly, getting to some of our key research results. We analyzed the data. We did focus a little bit more regionally, kind of consolidating the data from the south and then the north, just due to how different the weather and the climate can be. But when we look at yield, when desiccation occurred at R7, when we waited till R7, we rarely, if ever, saw yield losses as opposed to R6.5. We saw anywhere, it was pretty common to see 5 to 10% yield loss. So why is that happening? Well, a couple things I'd like to touch on. One, Seth Nave will be after me, but his lab published some research a few years ago. The critical window for yield determination in soybean is R4 to R7. Late pod development, seed development. Everybody knows that you need late season rains or your crop's going to be a dud. So we're arresting that soybean development just a little bit early in that period. And if we look at some research from Wisconsin a few years ago, we would expect that kind of yield loss, because in that last half of R6, we're still getting anywhere from 5 to 15% of our dry matter in our soybeans accumulated. From a seed quality perspective, those results were pretty similar. When we desiccated at R6.5, we were decreasing our protein and oil content as well. And then when we look at green stem, when we look at harvest timing, green stem, the results can be a little more variable. Our foliar products, our desiccants, work most effectively on leaves. Stems, the uptake from stems are going to be a little bit more variable. So we can still get some, we can still move the needle quite a bit on green stem, about half the time, which can be pretty advantageous if you have a real disaster. And then with harvest timing, we saw, as expected, a big number in days of earlier harvest in the south compared to in the north here, where we're talking just a few days, which still can be pretty critical when we're talking about weather, getting our cover crop planted, getting our winter wheat planted. But in the south, generally it's just more consistent heat and humidity, where in the north, we get into harvest season, it's 90 one week, it's 60 the next, it's rainy, dry. I mean, it's pretty, shake the magic 8 ball. You don't know what we're going to get day to day and week to week. So that's just a quick run through, just to wrap it all up with some of our key findings. Pretty much my recommendation anytime I give a talk is test it on your own farm. Most operations have the technology now that they can collect and generate some really good data and really hone in on the practices that work well on their ground, however localized or spread out that it might be. So moving on from there, we always want to make sure we're following the product label, adjuvants, application timing, pre-harvest interval that we should wait. We want to make sure that we're following the label. The default 5 we use at a 0-day pre-harvest interval. And then lastly, try to wait until R7 to minimize that yield loss. Like Justin said, we've worked so hard to get the crop we have, but there are situations with weather, with hurricanes, with things unpredictable things that can happen, where sometimes you gotta make chicken salad out of chicken what, and you gotta go a little bit earlier. So those are kind of the quick and dirty from that research study that we did. So once again, thank you for your time, and I'll stick around for the duration.
Thank you, Mark. And this is one of the things we really enjoy about Science for Success, is that we get to work on these research projects across the nation, learn from each other, and that enhances our ability to make better recommendations on these various production practices. And these graduate students like Mark are a critical part of getting that research done well. Now we'll turn it over to Dr. Seth Nave, an extension specialist and soybean expert at the University of Minnesota. And Seth is really a leading seed quality expert across the nation and the world. And as we think about these topics like desiccation, one of the things that inevitably comes up is harvest moisture, whether it has to do with desiccation or not. And so Seth's going to give us an overview of where things are sit with soybean seed moisture. Thanks for joining us, Seth.
Awesome. Yes. And thank you all for joining us. And thank you for participating. I'm going to make a little switch. As Rachel mentioned, we're going to talk a little bit on the backside of this. So we're going to talk about harvest timing. And the biggest issue that we hear around the Midwest is really around these really dry soybeans that are harvested in the fall. The issue really is that grain purchasers are not paying a premium for soybeans that are drier than 13%. So farmers really lose out on a proportional basis. So in round numbers, when soybeans are sold at 10% moisture, they're basically giving up about 3.3% of their yield or their total sales. So on a 60 bushel yield, that's 2 bushels per acre that they're losing out just in water that they're not being paid for by that grain elevator, that final terminal. So what I've shown here is a figure from the U.S. Soybean Quality Survey. So 2025 was the last survey. We're conducting the 2026 survey this fall. 2025 was actually the 40th year of this survey that's supported by the U.S. Checkoff of various formats, and it's been supported generously by the United Soybean Board over the past several years. The survey is really promoting both domestic and international utilization and movement of soybeans because of our quality parameters. So one of the things that we measure in our lab is incoming moisture. So this gives us a really good handle on the farm gate moisture of soybeans coming out of the fields. Soybeans come to our lab directly from the farm. They're sealed in plastic envelopes. I think this gives us a pretty good handle. The map shows you the variation that we saw in 2025. This is actually a lot flatter than we normally see it. This problem is normally most problematic in the western corn belt and less so in the eastern, but we had dry soybeans across much of the corn belt this year. So on average, we were at 10.2% moisture of our seed harvested in the U.S. last year. So if we blow this up to the big number, that's a 3.2% decrease in farm gate sales because of this moisture loss, because of shrink, and multiply that times the price of the total crop. We're at $1.4 billion of lost potential sales. Now, this is kind of a crazy number because there's no way that every farmer would be able to match perfectly a 13% soybean, but it does give us a little bit idea of the scale of this issue. I would also argue, and I think this could be debated certainly, but if we're losing 1 percentage point based on moisture and sales, I would assume that we're also losing a proportional amount of that or a similar number in terms of field losses. So shattering in the field prior to harvest, header loss, splits and threshing losses during harvest are all increased with drier seed. And then there's a bunch of additional downstream beyond the farm gate effects due to splits and grinding of that seed when it's drier than 13% that could cause losses beyond the farm gate. So I think we could very easily double these overall loss numbers when we look at overly dry soybeans. So what about management? And this is really the tricky part. It's really difficult for me to talk about the topic because there's not a ton that we can do. I would say that probably the best opportunity for us to gain some of this back is in storage conditioning. And unfortunately, for the Western Corn Belt, I think the best opportunity for conditioning soybeans, so this is adding moisture to our grain during storage. We can't add water, but we can add moisture through running fans with higher humidity, ambient humidity conditions. And so this works quite a bit better in the Eastern Corn Belt than it does in the West. And the Eastern Corn Belt generally doesn't have as much of a problem with overly dry soybeans. So I think we could mostly ameliorate most of this problem in the East, But in the West, where we harvest soybeans dry, we also have drier ambient relative humidities or air at that time. And so it's more difficult for us to condition soybeans. And there is a link. Haley generously put a link in the chat from North Dakota State University. Ken Hellevang has done a lot of work on this over many, many years, and it's a nice publication. Beyond that, there is certainly, we can work around harvest moisture management with appropriate maturity group selection. So identifying the best potential maturity group for your environment and your harvest logistics. The other harvest issues are a little bit harder to sell farmers. I mean, certainly starting harvest as early as possible in the fall, starting above 13% and trying to get those into bins and blended, or moving some of that moisture through the crop as it's stored is ideal. And then during the day, harvest more as much as the soybean crop on the shoulders of the day as we can. So start earlier, end later. And again, this is a challenge because farmers don't like to harvest under these really tough conditions, but adding that higher moisture soybean into those storage bins will probably help us out quite a bit. And even the toughest sell probably is switching crops and harvest to manage that soybean moisture. So in the north, where we're used to harvesting soybeans and then corn, moving back and forth based on our ambient conditions and able to allow some of those in-field soybeans to re-wet under certain conditions can be a huge advantage and can save farmers a lot of dollars on their sales. So farmers definitely have to run an ROI on this to see if it's worth moving back and forth and worth the hassle. But I think doing some simple math on losses based on overly dry soybeans and shrink could potentially help farmers save a few dollars. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Seth. And no doubt you're going to generate some questions for the Q&A on this topic. Our last presentation here before we move in the Q&A comes from another graduate student that's working with Science for Success, Prabhat Mudianselage, and he is working with Laura Lindsay at The Ohio State University on another National Science for Success trial, looking at the impact of harvest timing to kind of pull some of these topics we've covered together. And Prabhat, we'll turn it over to you.
Thanks, Rachel, and good afternoon, and thanks everyone for being here today for this webinar. And as Rachel mentioned, the objective of the project that I'm going to give an update on was to evaluate how soybeans responds to delayed harvest. So moving on to what we did. So as you can see in the map, this was a multi-state, multi-location project. We conducted field trials in 2024 and 2025 growing seasons, covering pretty much all of the major soybean growing regions across the US. Also I have color-coded the locations in this map. So each location is categorized into one of the 4 regions because our data analysis and results presentation is pretty much is going to be from a regional basis. Moving on to what we did in the field, here's a bird's eye view of one of our field locations in Ohio. So in this plot map, I'm going to focus on one replicate so you understand what we are working with here. So we had 2 planting dates for this study, a timely planting and a slightly earlier planting date for each of the locations. And within each planting date, we had 3 maturity groups of soybeans, a mid or more of an average maturity group for each location, and then a slightly earlier and a slightly later maturity group for each location. And then we went in and then we harvested each of these planting date and maturity group combinations at 3 distinct time intervals. So our first harvest was aimed at more around 15 to 13% moisture, or what we call a normal harvest timing for any grower. And then we did 2 subsequent harvests with a minimum of 2-week intervals between them to implement the delayed harvest treatment. Moving on to the results of this study, I'm going to focus mainly on yield, which is the most important parameter here. So this graph basically summarizes our yield results across both seasons and every location that we had this study for. So on the y-axis of this graph, we have yield in bushels per acre, and on the x-axis, we have harvest delay in number of days. So you can see we are moving from 0 days of harvest delay all the way up to around 60 days of harvest delay compared to that first harvest. And each panel here represents a particular planting date and maturity group combination. And within each panel, we have 4 lines, and each of these lines basically represents our 4 major regions that I described in the earlier slide. Moving on to some of the important trends that we observed. So the first thing that we obviously notice is that if you look at the southern regions, they are the regions that responds to harvest delay the most. So as you can see, when we are moving from 0 days of harvest delay all the way up to 40, 50 days of harvest delay, we're seeing an 8 to 10 bushels per acre yield loss, depending on when you are harvesting on the southern regions. But when we're moving on to the northern regions, we don't see such a steep response to harvest delay as we saw in the southern regions. But if you look at the early maturity groups, there's a slight decline in yields with respect to harvest delays. But as we move into mid and late maturity groups, we don't see that kind of a response to harvest delay with respect to yield in our northern regions. Some important conclusions from the 2 years of work that we have done here. We can see that the region is actually the main driver that drives how soybean responds to harvest delay. And as I mentioned, we see that south and southeast regions, they are the ones that are most responsive to delayed harvest with respect to yield. But not only yield, we did collect data with respect to lodging, green stem, and harvest losses as well, which I didn't include because this was a brief update on the research. We saw some fundamental trade-offs between green stem and lodging and harvest losses as well as a result. And also, moving on, we saw that there were we saw that Southeast region actually carried the most persistent green stem and also the steepest late delay declines in test weight as well as relative yields as well. But we're working on a fact sheet that will encompass all of these variables, data related to all these variables that we collected from this study last year, which will be coming out in the next couple of months. So you can keep an eye out for that. So that's all I have with respect to the update from the research. Thank you for your attention, and I will stick around for the remainder. Thanks.
Thank you so much, Prabhat, for giving us that overview of this national research and some of these hot topic areas we've discussed today. So at this point, we're going to move into the Q&A portion of the webinar. So we had a lot of questions that were submitted in advance, which is great. Some of those broad categories like foliar fertilizers and foliar fungicides, we will provide some research-based information on those in the chat. Since that was not a central focus of the webinar today. We're going to take 3 pre-submitted questions and kick off the Q&A section with those. But for those of you that are here live, we would love for you to use the Q&A and we'll pull the questions out of there and hopefully have a lively discussion here based on some of these brief topics and presentations today. So for our first question that was pre-submitted, we're going to pitch this to you first, Christy. There were several questions that revolved around desiccation for late season management challenges. So just want to hear your thoughts broadly on some of the best practices when we think about that topic.
Yeah, I think in general, we don't necessarily have to do a lot of late season desiccation of some of the weeds. A lot of it's going to depend on if your combine is going to be able to make it through as you're harvesting. When we do have some major weed challenges, we do have some different products, but there's a lot of different things to consider. Whether certain products are not going to work on certain weed species, right? So for example, if you have something like water hemp that's resistant to things like glyphosate, or it might be group 14 resistance, probably Sharpen's not going to work. So there's a lot of those types of things. Also making sure that we're waiting long enough to make sure that we're not applying any of those desiccation products too early. Another thing is some people think, well, maybe I can manage my seed bank that way. Pretty much at that point, when you're putting those desiccation treatments on, a lot of those weed seeds have already formed. So you're probably not reducing the amount of weed seeds that are going to go back into the field in the seed bank. What you're trying to do is really just try to manage your harvest efficiency and trying to reduce, a lot of the green stem problems, the green leaves going through your combine.
Thanks, Christy. That was the original reason desiccation was considered, was to control those late season weeds, and things have evolved quite a lot. So thanks for your current perspective on that. Another question that we had come in is, we've talked quite a bit in this webinar about desiccation and the potential advantages, and sometimes there's not advantages. But Seth, since you talked about seed moisture and the fact that there's limited management opportunities for related to mitigating that issue, can you talk a little bit about desiccation and what you've seen on the impact of seed moisture?
Yeah, I will, just follow up with Christy's comments about the North, because that's where we're familiar. We ran the same sorts of trials here in Minnesota, and we've seen the same thing that she noted, that desiccation products applied late really don't have much of an effect on the soybean. We don't move that soybean along very much. She mentioned 2 days in terms of maturity. And so we get a little bit of an assist in terms of reducing some of that grain moisture, but it's very, very small. So I think probably likely the question that farmers would like to have answered, or the issue that farmers might like to have answered, is kind of more uniformity of the grain, so that we don't have green lima bean type soybeans in along with some very, very dry soybeans. And honestly, the desiccation products that we've tried in the North haven't worked in that manner. So they haven't benefited us in terms of drying down those really low set pods on the plant that may be really plump, maybe late set pods. And so those desiccation products just haven't worked very well for us in the North. So I know it's a different story in the South, but we just don't get much movement. And it really isn't a management strategy that I would suggest for managing harvest moisture in any really great way.
Justin, did you want to add anything on that topic, perspective from Mississippi?
No, I think Seth hit the nail on the head there. I hold the same opinion of that. We don't really see. It does dry our beans down, and it'll dry us down extremely fast. But I think that's more of a result of the loss of the foliage cover. We've opened up the air channels in our planted rows, and we've allowed more sunlight to get down there, and it dries those beans out. So there's an advantage there. But we'll still see. We call them butter beans, Seth. That's for us in the South. We still see a lot of butter beans in some of our paraquatted or desiccated beans. So, I think it's a balance in terms of trade-off.
And maybe just to run this thing completely into the ground and mention green stems again, I think this is probably in the North, this is our largest issue. The largest complaints we get from farmers is green stem. And frankly, the desiccation products don't work very well at that specific issue. They don't create a more uniform set of stems out there for soybean harvest, and don't really accelerate the timing in terms of green stem per se. And so I think it has minimal value in terms of the issue that farmers face probably the greatest, or at least complain about the most in the North.
And
go ahead, Christy.
I was gonna say I would agree with Seth on that standpoint. Really, those products, the things that they do the best are really causing the leaves to dry up. Right? It doesn't really do anything for the pods. It doesn't really do anything for the stem. So it's kind of, where do things fit best? And in general, from our standpoint, it's more of a weed management if you need it, just to really dry down some of those greener weeds that might be out there.
Yeah, and I just wanted to add from perspective, I worked in North Carolina before came here to Illinois. And I think one of the issues with when we're thinking about desiccation and green stem is that you can't desiccate when you already know green stem is a problem. You're too late. You can't remedy the issue with the desiccant. But if you look at some of the work that Mark presented from our National Science for Success research, we did see some reduction in green stem from using these desiccant products. And I think that gets into the timing component. And when you're on the earlier end of that, before you would be able to tell if you had green stem or not. This is you got leaves out in the field. There's something there with its ability to help reduce that issue. We've seen it in our national research trials, but you can't wait until the problem's there and then expect to remedy it. That's some of the things we've seen from our national research trials. And Justin, you want to add anything else on green stem from your experience?
Yeah, absolutely. And I think that, this is the perfect segue into what I was going to mention on green stem. Those of us on the panel and some of the other soybean specialists, we all have continuing conversations on the topic because I think we all see a little bit different variety of green stem throughout the country based on our environments. But ours, a lot of times, does happen to have a lot of sticking or retainment of green leaves. And so, from a desiccant harvest aid standpoint, we do see that benefit. So, there is benefit in trying to desiccate beans where we know we historically have got green stem issues. But I think Rachel is exactly right. We have to do that before the leaves are gone and the only green stem is the issue. The fact of the matter is that most of the products that we use, or really all the products that we use, are more contact in nature, meaning they're not systemic. So they're only going to impact the plant material that they touch. And so, when we're applying that to, let's say we're applying paraquat to a field that has a green stem issues, there's not a lot of leaves left. It is literally just green stems. That doesn't give us a good target to have effective coverage for something like paraquat. And we're not going to see a good response from that application. And so we're continually working with green stem issues in our region of the country, just trying to figure out, A, what is the main driver in causing it, and then B, once we have realized it, and maybe it's too late for a harvest aid application, what are the best management practices moving forward with it?
Fantastic. Well, that's the beauty of having some national panelists here. We've got some different perspective on how things look across the country. And those were the 3 pre-submitted questions that we were going to address here. And now we're hoping to have some lively Q&A with those of you attending live. And so please use the Q&A function, submit your questions. We've already got one submitted. And Seth, I think I'll pitch this one to you first. What % higher yield potential is needed for longer season varieties being considered to offset the cost of desiccation applications in the Midwest region? You're on mute, Seth.
First time on Zoom, sorry. So yes, that's a tough question for me to answer. I would say that we just don't see the benefits of desiccation. So in the Midwest, we basically most of the Midwest, above I-80, we're going to be bumping up against fall conditions. So the fall, cool nights, short days are going to hasten maturity and push things along. We're going to run out of days to accumulate yield accrual. So it does not make much difference if you have a short season or a long season. You're going to get bumped up with those cold nights. It's going to terminate your crop. So you would having a long season variety out there isn't going to actually help you out much, because no matter what we do, we're going to end up at the end of the season, and we're not going to have additional days of any sort to accumulate light. So those longer season varieties aren't going to help us out in those situations. So I would say that there's no actual benefit to an overly long variety unless it had some crazy high yield potential way beyond what an adapted variety would have. And I don't think that there is such a soybean out there that I would know of. So I might be missing something in your question, but that's the way I would pose it. So if anybody else wants to jump in on top of that, they'd be welcome to.
I guess the one thing I would say is as you think about the products that we have, they are probably, even thinking about like a little bit of what Seth said, they're not going to work very well under the cool, wet conditions, right? So they're going to work better under warmer, drier conditions than cool, wet. So that's, that's where we see a lot of difference. We were trying a couple different soybean maturities, and some of those later ones that we, planted, it was, it really, even just as far as desiccating the leaf tissue, it took a lot longer than under a warmer, drier condition.
I guess just to restate my point here, I think what we're talking about is best utilization of those last days in the fall in the Midwest. And I think if we put out a long season variety in order to try to capture those extra bushel or two that we would have if we ended up with very, very good conditions. So above average rainfall with above average temperatures and have an extended fall condition. So that might be a situation where a long variety we could potentially capture some extra value from in some small fraction of the years that would pay off for us. And then in other years, we'd have to desiccate that thing early. So I think that might be the way to think about that question, is taking advantage of extra long years when they occur, and then desiccate that soybean early in those situations. So, but I agree with Christy. These things don't work that well. It's not something that is going to. This isn't going to make us a lot of room there, and so I don't see a lot of opportunity for taking advantage with those really long varieties.
Yeah, I know this was a Midwestern question, and certainly not one that has any application to the Mid-South, because we're going the opposite direction. We are more interested in earlier maturing varieties than we are later maturing, and you've seen that shift in our maturity groups. But I like the question because it is incorporating the cost of the desiccant application into the farm budget, and trying to see, okay, what advantage do we have to get from this from other inputs in order to make this pencil out. And we have to consider the same thing in the Mid-South, and why I brought it up with fungicide applications. And we often think about the price of a fungicide application, the additional yield that we're going to get from that. How often does that fungicide application pay, or how often does the yield benefit we get pay for the fungicide application? But then we're also having to factor in at that point, well, what about the desiccant? Because anytime that I see a R3 to R4 fungicide, I'm going to automatically, in our area, recommend a desiccant as well at the end of the season, because we retain so much of that greenness. And so I think that's what the question was getting to, was, what gain are we going to have to see from the new variety that we pick up in terms of a later maturing variety to pay for that gramoxone or whatever desiccant application. For us in the Mid-South, a desiccation application for the most part is fairly cheap. All of these products are on a pretty wide spectrum in terms of cost and effectiveness, but we've been able to apply pretty decent applications of desiccants for very little cost. And so the addition on in the budget for us hasn't been too taxing. It is something, but it's not too taxing. But it's certainly worth noting when we're making earlier season decisions of all right, how much extra is that going to cost us on the back end to finish this crop out?
Great. Thanks for your thoughts on that question. Next question, which I'll just leave open. What nutrients are most important in the late season to increase seed size?
I'll tackle this one. I'm no fertility expert, but we have a lot of folks, and I apologize if you guys can hear the sirens in the background. I'm out by the condo, and sounds like the fire department's done by. But we have a lot of high yield guys in our area, especially in the deep south, and their sole focus has been mainly on potassium mid to late season in terms of influence and seed size. Now, there are a lot of studies out there that are trying to dispute this, but anytime that I hear folks really focusing on seed size, potassium seems to be the top of the conversation. So we've actually got some work that we're looking at doing spoon feed potassium applications to see if we can influence a yield, because that's what we're looking for to increase bottom dollar. but also B, are there any secondary effects in that we may be able to know from a yield component standpoint, and seed size is one of those.
I would just jump in here and say that seed size late season, I think the first step is to think about this stay green thing that Justin mentioned and fungicides. We can increase seed size if we can stretch the seed filling period time out longer into the fall if we have the right conditions. So maintaining that canopy longer and healthier is going to potentially give us increased seed size and yield. So working backwards through that, the obvious one is nitrogen. If we're short of nitrogen, if we have poor nodulation and low mineralizable N, this leads to early senescence, and the opposite side of this thing is that we're going to end up with smaller seeds. So certainly good nodulation, if that's through inoculation or through natural rhizobia in the soil, and good soils with mineralizable N. Not related to fertilizer probably, but I think those are the type of things that we need to think about. So again, I would go back to the old agronomy standpoint here and just say build a good crop, a healthy canopy through good fertility program, and that's going to do the best for you. These mid-season applications of a foliar fertilizer are not something that's very likely to give you any extra seed size unless you are really short of mineral nutrition for one of those factors through the soil. So it might be a rescue treatment, but not necessarily something that should be built into a program.
And I'll second what Seth just said. In the areas that we see the best response from in-season nutrient applications is going to be those areas for us in the Mid-South that are extreme sand areas, low CECs, low organic matter, places where we're going to be more prone to deficiencies that may even procure themselves throughout the year, depending on our rainfall amounts and things like that can lead to nutrient runoff and leaching. Those are the areas that we're going to see the most success and the most response out of those. And if you notice that some of those high yield areas where they see some of those biggest responses from that are in very sandy, light textured soils.
Since we're putting you to work here, Justin, a couple of the pre-submitted questions were basically around late season irrigation recommendations. So can you just make a few comments on that?
Yeah, absolutely. We in the state of Mississippi are about 50% irrigated. We do have a lot of rolling hill country that is not irrigated, and so we have a fair share of both. But if you consider the bulk of our production and other mid-southern states like Louisiana or Arkansas and the Delta region, we have a lot of predominantly 90% furrow irrigation. And so we are very intensely managing our irrigation practices in soybean. Typically, we use a very generic water curve that shows that we begin our water uptake demand around the R1 to R2 growth stages, which is pretty self-explanatory. As we go into reproductive phases and begin to set the foundation for that crop, we want to begin to mitigate any kind of stress that may come upon that. And then we just maintain our soil capacity levels or a certain percent below our soil capacity levels. We do a good job at Mississippi State of using our master irrigator program as a means for introducing good info-based tools to manage irrigation timings and events. If you are not using a soil moisture meter in your field, I highly recommend doing that. There are multiple ways that different growers throughout history have used to determine when to irrigate, and the most accurate by far is using some type of soil moisture sensor. And so I can't advocate for that enough. If you're interested in that, we have plenty of faculty here at Mississippi State that are working on that. But using those throughout the season to make really good information-based decisions, and then using those late season growth stages to determine when to terminate that irrigation. We are mainly focusing on R6.5 for us here in the Mid-South as the last date that we want adequate moisture. We don't want to be dry at that point, but we do want adequate moisture to be able to fill that crop out. I do think that late season moisture, so if we irrigate too late or we get a large rainfall event after that in the R7 to a few days after R7 growth stage, we may see a little bit of a more induction of green stem. So something to be cautious about there. and not being too aggressive with our late season water use. But as for us in the Mid-South, if we are in the reproductive phases, we are strongly promoting water, and using our soil moisture sensors to drive those decisions.
Speaking of soil moisture sensors, Justin, we've got a question. Best soil moisture sensor you found that is easy user interface and wireless?
Oh Lord, I don't have a favorite. I would certainly default to one of my irrigation guys at Mississippi State. I have used several, and all have their own personalized interfaces. So I won't advocate any one brand, but I would say the best one to use is the one that you're most comfortable with. We have a lot of growers that install them, that get on there and it's a little too complicated and they just bail out and they never really use them. My recommendation is find one, really stick to it and learn the software and run with it. Some of those can incorporate with already existing scouting systems that you're using, so do some research into that. But I don't know that I could really just sit here and stand on a favorite that I've used.
Great. And also, Justin's contact information has been shared. And so if you want to connect with Justin, I'm sure he can link you up with someone at Mississippi State with more expertise in that specific topic. So we still have time for a couple more questions. So please submit those through the Q&A. But before the end of the webinar, we just wanted to cover a couple things. We would love if you can fill out this evaluation using the QR code here on the screen or visiting the link that's been shared in the chat. And that will just help us ensure that our programming is relevant and on point with the things that you're most curious about at this time. Also, if you are looking to get CCA credits, please use this to scan for your CCA credits using this QR code. If you encounter some type of issue doing that, then you can email our Science for Success program manager, Haley Ortmeyer Clark, with the information provided in the chat. So just a couple housekeeping things. We want to give you guys a couple minutes to pull those QR codes. But again, still time for a couple more questions. So we'll give it a second to see if any of those come up through the Q&A. And if not, I'll pull one more out of the pre-submitted topics. So we had several questions around late season pod retention and any management practices that can be deployed to help with that. So I'll open that up to the panelists for any comments on that.
I have, surprise, I have strong feelings about this. And so I'll speak for the North. We've determined pretty clearly in my lab that in Minnesota, at least, we are source limited in our soybean crop at the end of the year. Again, because winter and fall comes quickly, we basically are unable to completely fill seed adequately at the very end of the year because of the amount of source available. We have plenty of seeds in most cases, and so we don't tend to be seed number limited, and therefore increasing seed number, pod retention, seed abortion even in many cases doesn't necessarily tend to help us a ton. So far north perspective, but others may want to join in.
I'd say for the Mid-South, we do have the season to finish a lot of those out, and so we are concerned about that. But I think we've already hit on everything that I could say in terms of protecting those pods and reducing pod abortion, and that's just good, timely management throughout the season. And I think the most danger that we have in terms of pod retention for us is moisture management. Usually, I see a lot of pod abortion in saturated soils. And so making sure that, we can get water on, like we've already discussed, but also being able to get water off the field in the event of big rain systems. Insects can also pose extreme damage for us. So just making sure that we are understanding of what our insect thresholds are, what the proper management strategies are for those. Those seem to be the big areas for us in terms of pod retention.
Great. Well, we are running up on the end of this webinar. Thank you so much to our panelists from across the country covering various disciplines for sharing your insight today, and to all of the attendees for your engagement in this webinar. We realized that we were not able to get through all the pre-submitted questions. There were many, which was great, but hopefully if you have a question that was not addressed, contact information has been shared throughout the webinar. Please feel free to reach out to these folks or any of your local extension experts to get more information on these topics. And we hope to see you engaged in future Science for Success events. Give us feedback, and we hope to connect with you in the future.